So without further ado, I will introduce Dave Eldridge, who's one of the regional advisors at Foundations and is the author of this report. It's something I'm very keen for us to look at for a little while. I think probably the timing has been really good, because certainly looking at a lot of the posts in the Facebook group recently, it seems there's been a real increase in this area of work, particularly over the last 12 months or so, I guess, with people spending so much more time at home. So without further ado, I will pass on to Dave for him to introduce his report.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So, yeah, what I'm introducing today is a guide to adaptations for children and young people with behaviours that challenge. But before I introduce the guide, I should start off with a disclaimer. Paul often states that the sum of the knowledge in the room is greater than the sum of knowledge of the presenters. And speaking for myself, that is certainly the case. So although I have a general awareness about adaptations for children and young people with autism and or learning disabilities, I'm by no means an expert. And the other presenters and many of you listening will have far more knowledge and experience than me. That said, I hope the guide will be a useful resource, whatever level of knowledge and experience you might have. So why has the guide been written? Which is a prompt to move on to the next slide. Yep, there we go. So why has the guide been written? Anecdotally, it seems clear that councils are receiving an increasing number of referrals for adaptations for children and young people with complex needs, including autism and or learning disabilities. And as Paul's just mentioned, one indication of this is the number of queries about adaptations for children and young people with autism and or learning disabilities on the DFG Facebook page. There have been a number in the last week or two. Historically, however, DFG funds have been primarily focused on people with physical disabilities, with about 89% awarded to people with physical disabilities and only about 6.6, between 6.6 and 8.5% going to people under the age of 20. So predominantly to adults and predominantly to people with physical disabilities. It's also the case that where an application for a DFG for someone with autism and or learning disabilities is submitted, not everyone involved with dealing with the application will be familiar with the issues. And there is a need for better understanding about the needs of people with autism and or learning disabilities, and to a degree also the pressures which their families and siblings may be facing as well. The third issue is some adaptations tend to be expensive. Such adaptations tend to be expensive. And there is equally a need to understand not only the needs, but also the cost benefits which adaptations can deliver. And Professor Luke Clements from Leeds will be talking a bit more about this later in the webinar. And finally, then there is the legislative context provided by the Autism Act of 2009 and more recent Think Autism Governance Refresh published in 2018. So what are the aims of the guide? So the guide has four main aims. Firstly, to provide a bit of context and background to behaviours that challenge, particularly for people who are not familiar and may not have done much work with people with autism or challenging behaviour. The second purpose is to outline the rules and regulations regarding disabled facilities grants and discretionary housing assistance policies. Now many of you will be very familiar with this, but the guide is aimed at a wide range of audiences, and there will be some for whom this is less familiar and for whom some background will be helpful. Thirdly, to provide advice on how the funding could be used. There continue to be lots of questions and discussions about whether this or that circumstance is relevant for a DFG and or for discretionary assistance funding. And hopefully the guide will provide some advice and pointers about how the funding could be used. And to back that up, the guide also provides or includes case studies and examples of good practice to help in local decision making. So what the guide doesn't set out to do, it doesn't set out to be a reference manual, and it certainly doesn't tell you what to do. But I hope it will help practitioners better understand the needs of young people with autism and or learning disabilities and their families, and be more aware how DFG funds, whether used for a mandatory DFG or funding a discretionary housing assistance policy can be used to make a difference. So in writing the guide, there are certain key issues which stood out. The first one, and the most fundamental, I suppose, is that the starting point is understanding the reason for the behaviours and how to create a safe sensory environment. So when someone's behaviour challenges people around them, this is always a response to the person's needs and how they interact with their environment. So this means that it is therefore always essential to understand what sensory processing issues lie behind the behaviour, rather than focusing straight in on the behaviour. And this in turn then means that there is a need for multidisciplinary and multi-agency assessment and intervention planning. DFG funds provide one tool in the toolbox, but the specific approach for any one person wanting to take account of input from a number of different people and may involve a range of different interventions, and that may involve an adaptation. In some circumstances, an adaptation may not be appropriate. And I mentioned previously that mandatory DFGs tend to be focused on meeting the needs of people with physical impairments, primarily related to mobility. But the purposes for which a mandatory DFG can be given include making the home safe or safer for the disabled person and those who live with them. And this can encompass quite a wide range of possible responses. And in addition, as I've already mentioned, discretionary housing assistance policies, which local authorities can implement using the regulatory reform order, and indeed which over 90% of councils now have, means that councils can use their funding flexibly in order to meet local needs. And as new needs emerge, or as local authorities become more aware of specific needs, then those discretionary assistance policies can be flexed and changed and adapted to suit those needs in the locality. So the funds, DFG funds, are there to make a difference and to be able to provide an appropriate response for adaptations to meet the needs of someone with autism and/or learning disabilities, and that can make a significant impact. So using the funds effectively, meeting those needs, can make a huge difference to the life of a young person with autism and or learning disabilities and their families and caregivers. Secondly, adaptations, if they're done well and done rightly, done appropriately, can help to avoid the need for someone to be placed in residential care. And as the guide points out, residential care is not the best setting for anyone. It's certainly not the best setting for someone with learning disabilities and challenging behaviour. And lastly, as I've mentioned already, enabling someone to continue to live in the family home can deliver significant savings for health and social care budgets, when the cost of a placement can easily run otherwise into six-figure sums each year. So basically to sum up, this quotation is, the context for this is the Winterbourne View scandal, which happened some years ago now, but the broad sentiments remain the same. The norm should always be that children, young people and adults live in their own homes with the support they need for independent living within a safe environment. The guide will be available on the Foundation's website, can be downloaded from today, and I hope it will help people use DFG funding, use discretionary housing assistance policies in a way which can then meet the needs of children and young people with autism and or learning disabilities whose behaviour may challenge, to support them to lead the sort of lives they want to lead together with their families.